we have a number of people who are joining us online. I guess I'm going to now introduce Claire Dunn from MAV to give us an acknowledgement of country and to open the event. So huge round of applause for Claire as she makes her way to the lectern, please.
Hi, morning all. As Jeff said, my name is Claire Dunn. I'm the Built and Natural Environment Policy Manager at the MAV. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands on which we're gathered today. In my case, at the Monash Conference Centre, we're on the land of the Wurundjeri peoples. So the MAV is very excited to be partnering with BehaviourWorks today to help share the lessons from this particular research project BehaviourWorks undertook in partnership with a number of councils. The focus of the session today is on how best to educate the community to reduce contamination in curbside commingled recycling bins. I just want to briefly acknowledge that waste and recycling has been a very sort of busy and challenging space for councils over the last few years, really ever since China National Sword. Also very busy and challenging for the MAV, I might add. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot going to be happening over the next couple of years with the introduction of the container deposit scheme, curbside reforms. Let's see what we can do to successfully reduce contamination in commingled curbside recycling bins. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeff Payne.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Jeff Payne, and I just wanted to welcome you all here to this very special event, a co-production, if you like, of BehaviourWorks Australia and MAV. I just wanted to explain what is a councillor actually doing in MAV. We are invited sometimes, but we've got council officers in the room. So I just wanted to explain what the basic qualifications of a councillor are. One is that you're a citizen of Australia, and the second is that you're not criminal. That's basically it. So any random can put their hand up and be a councillor. And when I first started, I discovered that there was a lot that we had to think about as councillors, particularly when it comes to sustainability, climate change, and the circular economy. So why am I here? Well, it's because I happen to work at BehaviourWorks Australia. That's my day gig. And that's the basic workload of a councillor. We might get 400 to 800 pages a week that we have to read. And then we face up to council officers who start off with the most chilling line you've ever heard, which is, we take the papers as read. Do councillors have any questions? And it's a kind of a passive-aggressive IQ test. I know it's not, actually. It's the result of a lot of hard work. But the rest of us sit there going, okay, the questions I ask determine how much of the papers I've read and if I've understood the papers. So that's the kind of setting that many councillors have. So we are quite busy, but luckily today I get to cross the streams for the two things that keep me busy, council and BehaviourWorks Australia. BehaviourWorks Australia is a research enterprise. It's part of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and it's behavioural scientists looking at ways to basically work out how to encourage better behaviours in the world to make us a more sustainable society and community. And luckily I have my colleague Jennifer Macklin here today, who is the go-to guru when it comes to circular economy. She probably doesn't think that at all, but that's the beef that I'm giving her. That's the kind of cred that I'm giving her. And she's going to explain the work that she's done with councils in Melbourne, in Victoria, and also New South Wales in dealing with the growing problem of waste. Without any further ado, I am going to welcome Jennifer Macklin. Big round of applause as she makes her way to the lectern.
Thanks, Jeff. So it is really exciting to be here to be sharing what is the output of about 3 years of research, originally planned to be 12 months, and then COVID happened, and that caused multiple delays. But we were looking at contamination of curbside around the time that the China Sword ban was coming in, and it was actually a number of BehaviourWorks partners at the state and federal government levels that identified that this was a key topic that we wanted to apply behavioural science to. And we were incredibly lucky to have the support from those government agencies to actually partner with a range of councils across New South Wales and Victoria. And we came together to say, why is contamination of the curbside happening? What is driving those behaviours? And what can councils and the state government partners actually do to reduce contamination? So we did a number of things. We reviewed a whole lot of literature and existing research. We spoke to governments and councils about their experiences. We conducted a number of experiments to test some different ideas out, and we actually worked with councils to trial some programs on the ground. And we're really lucky today to have three people that actually were involved in those trials to share a little bit of the on-the-ground reality after I share the sort of the overview. But one of the things that was really key to doing this is to make sure that as researchers, what we were doing was really feasible. So a key part of this project was actually bringing about 70 different councils and 70 people from different councils, waste contractors, the state government, all the different people involved in this together to come up with some of these ideas based on the literature about what we wanted to test. And I think the really important thing that we learned in trying to understand contamination from a behaviour perspective, what is it that leads households to continue to put things in the recycling bin that we don't want to see there? And what we found was that it's actually a whole range of things that are going on. There are things about each individual person, about the things that they know, the habits that they've developed, how they feel about waste, how trusting or sceptical they are to council, how trusting and sceptical they are in general, how much they're committed and how much time they can devote. There's also more social aspects. Who are they in households with? How do the people around them feel about this? Do their kids learn about this in school and come home and nag them about different things to do? But also the physical environment. So there's a whole lot of things that are going on. And when we want to change behaviour, we actually need to work out which of these is the most important in any particular context and make sure that what we're doing targets the specific things that are leading people to do this. So we did a number of things to try and look at these different drivers. One of the things that we did was we set up different experiments and trials. We ran a series of Facebook experiments that actually said what works to even just grab people's attention long enough to understand if they know how to recycle and then to maybe come through to more information. We ran a series of experiments looking at different flyers that said how can the content and the layout of flyers actually affect whether or not people learn better what is and isn't recyclable. And then we ran a whole lot of trials that actually said, well, what happens if we combine this with specific ways of interacting with households to actually change the behaviour? Because one of the things that we know is just getting the knowledge right isn't sufficient because there are so many other things that are impacting, like the physical environment, like how many other things they have going on in their life. So for Facebook experiments, what we did was basically trial a whole range of different messages to see could we get cut through? Could we grab people's attention long enough to actually get them to click through to a page about what is and isn't recyclable on council websites? And we basically took a general message and we tried 4 different versions of it. We have a report that shows all of the messages that we trialled and all of the results. But it was interesting that every council seemed to have slightly different results. So what worked in one council wasn't always as successful in another council. We tried flyers where we looked at, again, different ways of presenting information, different messages, again, to capture that attention and to see how well people could sort after they saw the flyers. One of the things that we did was really focus on apartments, and we know that recycling in MUDs or multi-unit dwellings can be particularly problematic. So we looked at what happened if we changed the context of the bin bays. We developed really clear messaging and signage around just 2 contaminant items, bagged recyclables and soft plastics, to say if we really narrowed down and focused on these 2, could we make some change in these 2? One of the things that was really important about this, we realised, is that often people are a little bit oblivious to what goes on and they don't notice changes. So a key aspect of this was actually contacting people beforehand to say we were coming to your building to make changes. So we let them know to look out. So we were priming them to say you're going to see changes, make sure you look out for them to actually increase the likelihood they would see these new posters, they would see these new bins. We did another thing with MUDs where we actually tried to provide reusable bags based on this feedback that a lot of people in apartment buildings don't have room for a separate bin. So we tried actually providing bags. Some councils tried plastic bags, some councils tried paper bags. But again, we let people know that we were doing this, that we were trying to help the purpose of doing this, and then we provided the bags. And our final thing was looking at providing personalised feedback. So building on some of the bin tagging programs that a number of councils were already doing to see could we optimise those. And again, when we spoke to a number of councils who had done this in the past, a couple of things came up. One was that when councils first introduced programs, they often experienced a bit of reactance, the community saying, oh, what are you looking through our bin for? Why are you slapping us on the wrist for doing things? So we actually, again, started with a sort of what we call the priming postcard to let people know that we're coming, why we're doing this, how it's going to be helpful, how this is working together, and that it's not punitive. And then we separated out the sort of what we were calling the reinforcing bin tag from the kind of corrective bin tag, and we realised that we didn't want people to feel shame or guilt. So some of our councils actually tried putting the corrective tag into the letterbox so that it wasn't visible and only making the positive tag visible. Other councils trialled the sort of more standard way with the bin tag on the actual bin. And one of the things that we really learnt, so priming postcards, and then the other thing that we really learnt, you can't see this message in too much detail, but it basically says, thanks for being a good sort. We didn't see any soft plastics or bagged recycling in your bin today. And that really specific message was actually really important because we'd had experiences from other councils who just said, thanks for being a great recycler, thanks for doing the right thing, and the next time they went back, contamination increased. And what we realised was if you're not really specific when you're providing that feedback to councils, residents actually go, oh, I got a good sticker on my bin, that means everything in my bin was correct. Even though we know that visual inspections often can only see about the top quarter content. So we needed to be really specific and say, we didn't see any bagged recyclables and soft plastics, so they knew that that's what we were looking for, and also that we didn't know if there were any else that we didn't see, so they could self-correct. So even if actually they had put soft plastics in the recycling bin, but they were getting this tag, they knew that that wasn't correct. So we really tried to tailor to some of those barriers. And a couple of really key things that we learnt across all of these trials. Now, the specific results are all available online. We will share that with everybody afterwards so you can dig into the detail. But the first thing, and this is a little bit disappointing for a lot of our council partners who are doing this, is that actually targeting contamination, putting rubbish in the recycling, and leakage, the recycling ending up in the rubbish, at the same time actually confuses people. And what we found was that people either went with, if in doubt, leave it out, great for contamination, or put it in just in case, great for leakage. But when you tackled both, people picked one of them. And when you were actually trying to focus on what you wanted in the bin, people were like, I better put it in just in case, because getting everything that's recyclably in the bin is most important, and that increased contamination, even when we were trying to reduce it directly. So what we have learnt from this is that you need to focus at any particular time. If contamination is your biggest problem, focus on what you want out of the bin very clearly. And then if you find that you're losing too many recyclables into the rubbish stream, come back later and look at that. Don't try and do, we want all of these things in and we want all of those things out at the same time. So really focus down. The second thing is that actually designing messages designed to capture attention and to motivate people to do things can be really impactful, and they can also make things worse. And this comes back again to these confusing messages. So we actually tested a couple of messages that we thought might help. So we were like, Australia's recycling system is changing, China sword, all these things going on. Now more than ever, it matters what you put in your recycling. The other one was, in New South Wales, 80% of what goes in the yellow bin does get recycled, and with your help, we can get that even higher. Now, we think both of these messages target that idea that we need to recycle a lot, and actually led people to go with the put it in just in case. So even though this flyer was directly designed to reduce contamination, it increased it. So testing your messages is really important. The messages that we found that were really helpful were actually around the consequences of putting the wrong thing in the bin. Now, these could be really specific around putting to the person, putting the wrong thing in means your bin might not get collected. It could be more general to the council, putting the wrong thing in costs council, and therefore you is the implication. Or more broadly, putting the wrong thing in actually means that things might not get recycled. So that idea about consequences really seemed to focus attention. Finally, we did try this optimising of traditional education campaigns around things like posters and signage in mud. So we tried to bring out all the behavioural insights tricks that we know. We tried to target those specific attitudes and behaviours. And what we found was that the councils who just focused on putting posters on their posters and stickers in their bin bays didn't get any obvious change in contamination. Now we're going to hear from one of our councils who actually went a step further and in trying to reduce soft plastics contamination actually added a soft plastics dedicated bin, and that actually did get different results. But when we just focused on trying to do really good educational material and hope that the educational material changed behaviour, it didn't. It wasn't sufficient to actually change the behaviour. The thing that worked really well out of all of our trials was providing personalised feedback, looking in the bin, seeing what was in there and providing that feedback back to councils. And we're going to hear from two of our councils about their experiences in doing that. Now, we know that feedback really works for single unit dwellings, for SUDs, and not so well for multi-unit dwellings because it's the personalised part of the feedback that's really important. And in apartment buildings, we can't tell which residents put what in the bin. So we still actually need to investigate what is going to work for apartment buildings. But for those of you who are still struggling with contamination, of all the things that we looked at and all the things that we tried, the personalised feedback was the most effective at really reducing soft plastics and bag recycling to almost zero in the majority of houses that received that feedback. So just a couple of things to take away from this before I hand over to hear a little bit more about some of those programs in detail. The first thing, as I say, really work out what's the problem you want to address and focus just on that. We went down to specifically bagged recyclables and soft plastics, and we were able to see some changes around that when we focused on that. Sometimes the lists of things that you don't want can be really, really large. We would recommend, from a behavioural science perspective, to focus on something until you see the change you want, and then to try the next problem and then the next problem, rather than trying to tackle everything at once. What we find again and again is if you target's too wide, if you're trying to do too many things, you don't get enough change on any of them. The second thing is really know what's going on for your residents in your community, what's specifically driving them. Incorrect beliefs about how recycling happens, about what is recyclable, is definitely a problem for most people, but there are other things that are also going. One of the interesting things was this idea that a lot of people who have been in Australia for a long time think they know what is recyclable, and so don't read recycling material because they go, oh, this is how to recycle, and I know how to recycle, so I don't need to read it. So actually, what you need to address is the overconfidence, not the lack of knowledge. And when you go into the thing, you can see that in the report, we actually break down for each of our trials the specific things that we did in those trials to address different barriers, so that you can see, if you know what's going on in your community, which of the different insights that we applied might be relevant for your own campaigns. Finally, where you can, and we found Facebook to be really useful, but any social media platform generally has these built in, actually test your messages first. So a lot of our councils who did Facebook found it really easy, really cheap, $1,000 to run a campaign to test 4 different messages to see which of them actually got people to click through to the website, for example. So actually setting these up, coming up with some ideas and then testing them. You can also test them in focus groups to see what people think you mean before you roll them out across your council and potentially, like us, make things worse instead of better. And finally, so this was just one of the examples, sorry, I meant to show this. This is one of the examples where we talked about social norms. So we tried to make it see that most people in this particular council, Blacktown in Sydney, are doing the right thing. So get on board if you're not. And what we found was that just saying that most people are recycling right, which is the second one, didn't have an impact. When we added a smiley face to kind of make it feel a bit better, we got a little bit more impact. And when we added a person actually there doing the right thing, we got a really strong result. So just by testing different ideas about this idea of a social norm, a positive norm, that they can be part of this community doing the right thing, we got really different results just by changing the picture on the message. And finally, where you're not already doing so, we would really recommend you looking into bin inspection and bin tagging programs as the technology improves, as more trucks get cameras and the AI gets really smart and can detect what contamination is, and we can actually start to see things like feedback will become much more cost effective. At the moment, it is still relatively intense, but it does really give results. And if you're already doing feedback, look at, is there a way that you can optimize it? Do you know exactly what effect? Are you potentially reinforcing some behaviours that you don't want to do? Can you change some of the messaging, be more specific, use some more behavioural insights to potentially grab more of your audience, to address more of the barriers that are stopping people from recycling? So that's a really quick overview, which is really just designed to whet your appetite and say all this information is online to download, to go through and find. We have a summary report that just has the high level takeaways like you've seen today, and then we have really detailed reports if you're interested about flyers, if you're interested about Facebook experiments, and if you're interested in any of the field trials that we did.
I've got a few kind of obvious questions. I think it's ironic that we send out brochures saying recycling and people go, I know exactly what to do with this, bang, straight in the recycling bin. They don't actually read it. So, Jen, why is information not enough?
I think that we often realise, particularly in things like recycling, that people don't know what to do. And we know that's true. We know when we talk to them, they are confused. So we think that if we give them the information, that they will then read it and remember it and change their behaviour. But what we know about trying to change behaviours, there's so many things going on. If you just stopped and catalogued all of the information that you got in any one day from the minute you woke up, from the things that your people around you are telling you, to what's on the news, to what's on the radio, to what you see on advertising, the amount of information that is actually thrown at people every day is ridiculous. And so our brains are really good at just going, what's relevant to me right now? No. Oh, that looks interesting. No. And sadly, unless we've done something to grab their attention, or for some reason it's already on their radar, most of the time information just gets sorted by the brain and says no.
You're a behavioural scientist. Isn't there some clever, dark art that you can do to manipulate people, to trick them into doing the right thing, like a sticker that says, thanks for nothing, or like passive aggression or something? Is there some clever brain way of getting people to change their behaviour?
Look, behavioural science has developed a number of what we would call behavioural insights, things that tend to work in most situations. So positive social norms is one of them. If you highlight that there is a majority of people doing something, most people consciously or unconsciously want to be part of that group, and so they'll change their behaviour. So there are little tricks that you can do when the behaviour is already really easy, when there's not a lot of cost to the person to shift. There are little tricks that you can do. But most of the time, the behaviours that we're looking at, they exist for a reason, and it's because things are hard. Fear and shame can change behaviour, often in the short term, but it can cause much longer term problems in terms of a relationship that you have with the community and keeping them on board long term.
Heavy enforcement's not the answer.
So enforcement in terms of consequences can work, but it's the way that you do it. So for most people who are on board, you're still in the nice, engaging, collaborative partnership mode, and you only go to enforcement for people who really need a reason to do it. And it can be effective as long as it's done in the right way.
About how many households were involved? Was the information in different languages? And what about QR codes?
Yeah, so we did actually work with 6 different councils across the field trials for those 3 programs, and every council had to have at least 300 people involved. Some councils had much more, depending on who they could access. For the single unit dwelling, the detached housing, and for the MUDs, we had to have at least 6 different kind of either apartment towers or apartment buildings. In terms of the languages, it was really interesting. So a lot of our work around the Facebook and the flyers, that was all done in English, and it was only with English-speaking people. But a lot of the councils that we spoke to who did have large multicultural populations actually found that when they looked at people from non-English speaking backgrounds, the proportion who were from a non-English speaking background and proficient in English versus non-English speaking and not proficient in English, the majority of their residents were actually still proficient in English. So the number of people not proficient in English were very small. So for our particular trial, we decided to focus on people who were proficient in English, regardless of whether or not it was their first language. Some of our councils did do translations because that's part of their policy. But what our experience has told us outside this trial, but in other research, is that when people come from different backgrounds, often there is way more going on than just knowledge. People coming from completely different cultures, different relationships to waste, people coming from places where it's not their job to sort waste, that's someone else's job, and it doesn't matter what you tell them, you're not going to change that identity about my job is not to touch waste.
QR codes, were they part of the postcard?
No, we did start this before COVID. So before QR codes were a thing. But again, one of the things about the code is, because since then we've looked at things, that again, you need people to have a reason to take time out of their day, headspace to notice it, to think that it's worth scanning, to take the time to scan it. So again, it's all about how do you grab their attention? How do you trigger that motivation to actually say, yes, I will look at whatever information you're trying to provide.
All right, we've got a question about anything done to increase the following on social media, because I find most residents are not engaged with council's Facebook or other social media.
Yeah, so that was definitely a really important point that we had. Some councils were talking about how many of the community that they were captured. What we decided was we actually used the advertising component of Facebook, which actually goes generally to the population. I think it was about $1,000 for a 3-week campaign for most of our councils. The number of extra people that they got was relatively small, but from a cost perspective, $1,000 to get a few extra attention compared to rolling out bin inspections when you're looking in the bins of hundreds of people, there is some value there, but you do need to go beyond the people who have already signed up to council if you want to get change.
All right, a question about the recent issues around soft plastic recycling. Has that impacted contamination in yellow bins?
Look, we haven't done any research directly about soft plastics, but we know that the people generally who were taking to Red Cycle were doing that because they knew it couldn't be recycled in yellow bins. So the conversations that we've had suggest that it's not going to increase contamination, but it is a problem in the sense that not having a solution for soft plastics makes it harder, because a lot of people feel better about the waste they create by being able to recycle things. And so being able to put things in the recycling bin makes them feel better, and not having an alternative recycling system for people makes them feel worse if they have to put it into the red bin.
How long before the bin inspections taking place were the priming postcards given out to the street?
So we based ours on how councils were doing collections. Most councils do fortnightly collections, and our kind of look at it was to say, we go in for the first collection, as we said, a lot of them we actually looked in the bins and we gave them a postcard that said all of the information. And by the way, we didn't see anything, great job. Or, and by the way, we did notice some stuff, make sure you keep it out. So we did that on the first collection, the first bin inspection, 2 weeks beforehand, and then came back for the feedback. The same with the bin bay materials and the reusable bags. We did it 2 weeks before because we wanted to have it far enough in advance that somebody might actually read it, particularly if it comes in, sits on the counter, but not so far that people won't still remember it when they see the next thing that you come and do with them.
Who was doing the inspections and putting feedback on bins, council staff or the contracted collector?
We had both. We had some councils who did it in-house, and we had some councils who actually did it through their contractors, and some councils who hired casuals directly for the work. Part of what we did as the program, and these are definitely available to make, is we just made videos that actually did some training. They were like 5-minute videos that went through what they needed to do, and we shared them with our council partners, and they were super easy.
Labelling on all packaging needs to improve. Colour triangle on every part of packaging would help educate the community. Purple triangle glass bin, yellow triangle recycle bin. Needs to be in every part of packaging, the inner bag, the outside box. This would be easy to identify and user-friendly. No matter what language is spoken, needs to be a national initiative. Do we need to get national about this?
So we do have efforts towards a national labelling scheme. It is being run by the packaging industry. It is being rolled out. There are some challenges, particularly for councils who have rural populations where their access to infrastructure is not the same as the majority of councils that are in more metropolitan areas. Those labels are pretty effective at getting people to do it again when residents look at them. So no matter what type of information it is, whether it's a label, whether it's a postcard, the first thing we need to do is grab their attention and tell them to look at it and actually encourage them to do that.
So someone's asked, what's the recommendation for residents that keep making the mistake after we took all the steps to engage with them? Communication, signage, one-on-one. I think it should be excommunication as well. Can we banish them from the...
So, look, it is one of the councils that we worked with who didn't end up finishing because of COVID, but then did it themselves. As I said, they were one of the councils that have this layered approach. So they have an enablement approach. The first thing they do is try and make it as easy as possible. Then they have an engagement approach. They try and use sort of collaborative partnership approach around language to get people to change their behaviour. And then they move into a direct feedback, and then in an enforcement phase. But as I said, it is a process about, it's not so much getting stricter over time, but that's kind of the idea, is starting out a bit softer and getting a bit firmer and moving. And we find the councils that do the bin rejections and the bin removals tend to find that does mostly address their problem. But most research says there's always going to be 5% of your population, doesn't matter what you do, who are just not going to get on board.
Has any other technology been used, such as RFIDs, that radio frequency IDs in the bins?
Yeah.
Programmed against individual addresses to identify contamination.
Yes.
Imagine the blowback from that.
Well, no, it's interesting actually. So there are some councils, the ones I know of in Sydney, that's where I live, so that's where I'm more familiar. There are some councils who have actually begun rolling out RFID tags on tags. They have their the scanners in the trucks to actually video the contents from the hopper camera. At the moment, they sit there with the iPad and they watch the video and then they tag. AI places have actually started looking at how can AI actually detect the contamination. But so one of our councils that I know of actually does that, records the video, checks the thing. They have the RFID tag, they go back to council and they just send letters, and it includes a photo of the bin. Once that technology is sorted, I think we'll find that the ability to know in single unit dwellings who is doing what and what we need to change, we'll get leaps forward in that information. And as we heard, that's really what we need to know in order to target and change people's behaviour. Multi-unit dwellings, still an open question.
Well, we are at time. So will everyone please give Jennifer Macklin a big round of applause. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for being here. And thank you, Claire, from MAV.